I said, "What are you doing here?" Pedro smiled slowly. He said, "I work for Walter now. I am a driver at his company." My heart stopped. "What?" Pedro pointed toward the house. He said, "I came for the envelope." My hands began to shake. I walked to the cabinet and picked up the brown envelope. When I returned, Pedro was watching me carefully. I handed him the envelope, but he didn't leave. Instead, he leaned closer and said, "So, Walter doesn't know about our marriage?" I froze. It was not a question. It was a statement. My throat felt dry. Pedro laughed and said, "I thought so." Then he turned and walked into the street. I closed the door and locked it quickly. My hands were shaking. I hoped I would never see him. The next evening, Leo had a small fever, so he slept earlier than usual. I checked his room 3 times before going to the bathroom. I turned on the shower and let the warm water run over my shoulders. For a moment, I tried to relax. Then suddenly the lights went out. Everything became dark. The shower was still running, but the bathroom was completely silent and black. My heart began to beat fast. I said to myself, maybe the power went out. Then I remembered Leo. I quickly put on my bathrobe and walked into the hallway. I opened the door to Leo's room. Leo was still sleeping peacefully. I felt a small relief. Then I heard something. My body froze. The sound came from the front door. It was almost midnight. The sound came again. I stopped in front of the door. My hands felt cold. I said, "Who is there?" I opened the door. My blood ran cold. I knew that voice. Pedro. I slowly looked through the window. Pedro was standing under the porch. He was smiling. He said, "Jasmine, I know you were inside." I said, "Go away." Pedro said, "Jasmine, you forgot something." I said, "What?" He said, "Your past." Every night around 11 p.m., the bell rang. Sometimes Pedro spoke. Sometimes he just stood there smiling. One night he said, "You look tired." Another night he said, "Walter seems like a nice man." Each time he reminded me of my secret. Each time he reminded me he could destroy my marriage. I stopped sleeping well. Every sound made me nervous. One night, Pedro looked through the window and said, "I saw your baby today. Cute kid." I closed the door immediately. That night, I held Leo in my arms and cried quietly. I realized something important. I had escaped Pedro once, but now fear was returning to my life again, and I could not allow that. Not for my child, not for my family. The next night when Pedro knocked, I opened the door wider. He looked surprised. He said, "Well, this is new." I looked directly at him. I said, "Come tomorrow night." Pedro raised an eyebrow. He said, "Why?" I said, "I want to talk." Pedro smiled. He said, "Good. Maybe we can remember old times." The next day, I prepared carefully. I called Walter's office manager, Mr. Harris. I told him that one of the drivers had been coming to my house late at night and threatening me. Mr. Harris sounded very concerned. He said, "I will come tonight." That evening, I waited. At 11 p.m., the doorbell rang again. I opened the door. Pedro stepped closer. He said, "So are you ready to talk?" I said, Yes, come to the side of the house. Pedro followed me toward the driveway. The yard was dark and quiet. Pedro looked around. He said, "What is this?" Then suddenly, the porch lights turned on. A car stopped in front of the house. 2 men stepped out. One was Mr. Harris. The other was a police officer. Pedro's smile disappeared. The officer said, "Pedro Adams, we received a report that you have been harassing this woman." Pedro looked at me with anger. He said, "You called them?" I said, "Yes." Pedro tried to laugh. He said, "She's lying." But Mr. Harris shook his head. He said, "I have also received complaints from other workers about your behavior. You are fired." The police officer stepped closer. He said, "And if you come back here again, you will be arrested." Pedro looked angry, but he said nothing. He turned and walked toward the street. Before leaving, he looked back at me. But for the first time in years, I was not afraid of him, because my past was not my shame. It was my survival. The next evening, Walter called me. His voice sounded tired. He said, "Jasmine, how are you and Leo?" I said, "We are fine." Then I took a deep breath. I said, "Walter, when you come home, I need to tell you something about my past." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." 2 weeks later, Walter returned home. That night, after Leo fell asleep, I told him everything. Walter listened quietly. When I finished, I looked at him with fear. But Walter took my hand. He said, "Jasmine, you survived something terrible. You don't need to hide that from me." Tears filled my eyes. For the first time in many years, I felt completely free. Sometimes the past returns to scare us, but fear only has power when we stay silent. And that night, I finally chose the truth. If you were in Jasmine's place, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. If you liked this story, please like, comment, share, and subscribe.